Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Group of 78's annual policy conference for 2022. My name is Roy Culpepper. I'm the chair of the Group of 78. This year, our topic is transforming international finance toward economic, social, and planetary justice. We acknowledge that the Group of 78 operates from traditional, unsurrendered, and unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. We recognize that the work of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples is a responsibility of all Canadians and must be integral to the G78's work on peace, environment, and social justice. Furthermore, we recognize Indigenous knowledge situates humans within the context of the natural world and includes respecting it rather than plundering it. And it calls for relationship building not only with other humans, but also with our natural world in all its aspects. Reconciliation requires that we honor these precepts and their origin. 3 years ago, the G78 convened our 2019 conference on the topic, Global Markets, Inequality, and the Future of Democracy. Among its key messages were that global inequality is accelerating. Increasing wealth and income inequality is a consequence of deregulation and liberalization of financial markets and more frequent financial crises. And neoliberal fiscal and monetary policies have played a crucial role by exacerbating inequality. These perverse trends highlighted in our 2019 conference have only worsened in the pandemic. The pandemic's most significant outcome will be increasing inequality both within and between developed and developing countries. Recently, Scientific American, not usually a source for radical social commentary, noted with alarm that as a result of the pandemic, global billionaire wealth grew by $4.4 trillion between 2020 and 2021, while at the same time more than 100 billion additional people fell below the poverty line. This year's conference will revisit the issues discussed in 2019. Our focus this year is on transforming international finance. Why? Because it has been evident for some time, since before the pandemic, and even before the great financial crisis of 2007-2008, that driving most of the world's economic and social injustices and growing inequality is an increasingly autonomous and powerful international financial system. This system remains as autonomous, powerful, and unstable as ever, notwithstanding the so-called reforms triggered in response to the 2007-2008 crisis. By fueling investment in the production and consumption of fossil fuels and other emitters of greenhouse gases, finance is also at the core of climate catastrophe, the most urgent issue of our time. At this conference, we want to move the goalposts from identifying the failures of the global economy to identifying the solutions. Accordingly, our premise is that to secure economic, social, and planetary justice, we must transform international finance. But given the globalization of financial markets, there is no indelible line between international finance and domestic finance. To transform international finance, to contain its power to destabilize and undermine domestic markets, we must therefore empower domestic institutions and domestic economic policy and give them space to serve the national interests. Thus, some of the presentations at this conference focus on the scope for strengthening domestic institutions and policies alongside constraining the power of international financial markets. The global context for this conference is shifting profoundly. As mentioned, the underlying weaknesses of the international financial order have not been resolved since they were exposed in the crisis of 2007-2008, and indeed in a series of financial crises dating back to the early 1980s. Debt distress is afflicting a growing number of countries in the global south, as well as households and businesses everywhere. Such problems will be exacerbated by inflation, by the post-pandemic rise in the cost of living, and by the mainstream policy response in the form of sharply higher interest rates. It's been in the news over the past few weeks. And fiscal austerity is coming sooner or later. Meantime, global trade is being upended, partly as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war. Moreover, failure to address the existential threat posed by the climate crisis makes all other international problems, save the growing threat of nuclear war, seem trivial in comparison. To sum up, we have 40 years of evidence that neoliberal policies and global financial disorder have wreaked economic and social havoc around the world. And we have very clear and very present evidence that man-made climate catastrophe is now upon us. So it is time to move beyond diagnosing these problems to implementing actionable policies that will bring economic and social justice and assure planetary survival. So all that said, let me walk you briefly through our plan for this conference. We're opening today with our first in-person post-pandemic conference in 3 years. So welcome all of our in-person audience to this session. Many of us have been looking forward to the opportunity to chat informally over lunch or coffee at our events. However, we are following a hybrid format with 3 out of our 4 keynote presentations scheduled to come to us from Australia, the UK, and Switzerland. And some of our audience today are here in person while others are joining us through Zoom. So we have to go hybrid because of the nature of the beast. Our 4 keynote presenters today, we're going to have 3 keynote presenters today, and I'll explain why in a minute. They will provide an overarching perspective on how to achieve economic, social, and planetary justice in the recovery from the pandemic amid increasing global financial disorder and deepening climate chaos. Jim Stanford, who will be first off, will address the labor market issue posed by the goal of achieving a fair transition towards a decarbonized economy. Richard Kozel-Wright will argue for a new financial architecture that would support economic and ecological justice. Then we were scheduled to have Grace Blakely, who was going to examine how to respond to the cost of living crisis in the post-COVID world. But unfortunately, she's had to withdraw at the last minute. I just got notice from her office this morning. So in lieu of Grace's online presentation, we're hoping that her office will send us a video clip that we can play in her absence. And those who wish to view that are welcome. But there is an alternative. As most of you must know, there's the climate strike, the Fridays for Future demonstration taking place in Parliament Hill, which is a few minutes away from here. So over the lunch break, we now have the latitude, if you wish to express solidarity with the folks in the climate strike, please do join them. But please do come back for our last presenter, Senator Rosa Galvez, who will be joining us in person, and she will talk about how finance can and must be aligned with our climate goals. Next week, we are hosting 3 virtual panels featuring 7 speakers exploring critical nodes in the international financial system. In the first on Monday, panelists Mark Platt and Matthias Vernengo will examine the future of the international currency system. Are we doomed to be stuck with a system based on the US dollar, giving the United States an exorbitant privilege, as the former French finance minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing famously put it, a privilege shared by no other country? What scope, if any, is there for the special drawing right, for example, to become a truly international currency? Next, transforming the international system also means enhancing the scope of domestic financial systems and domestic economic policies. In the second panel on Tuesday, John Anderson, Susan Spronk, and Heather Whiteside will examine how national banking institutions and monetary and fiscal policies, including those in Canada, can be reoriented to meeting public needs and public priorities. And in our third panel on Wednesday, Andres Arauz and Ulrich Binseil will examine financial innovation such as fintech, cryptocurrencies, and central bank digital currencies. Are such innovations simply vectors for financial speculation, feeding wealth accumulation by the few, not to mention illicit and criminal activities? Or can they actually be democratized and work in the public interest? Finally, on Friday, our student rapporteur team will present key messages and policy recommendations emerging from the conference. We have two members of our rapporteur team with us this morning here in the conference hall. Before we move on to our first keynote speaker today, on behalf of the G78, I'd like to thank a number of people and organizations for making this conference possible. We have been generously supported by the Broadbent Institute, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, the Canadian Labour Congress, the National Union of Provincial Government Employees, the Canadian Pugwash Group, and the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. The University of Ottawa has helped provide this wonderful venue and catering for today's in-person session. Thanks must also go to our conference organizing committee, which is essentially the G78's 10-member economic and social justice working group. And some members of that group are with us this morning. I see Angela has just joined us. I'd like to thank all our distinguished speakers and moderators for their time and fertile thoughts. We are honored by your participation in our conference. We are very grateful for the team of student rapporteurs from Carleton University and the University of Ottawa, who will be asking some questions of our speakers, taking careful notes, and helping us to compile a report of this conference. We're grateful to all our members, many of whom are participating today. If you are not a member, please join the Group of 78 if you appreciate the value of our conferences and our programming more generally, to ensure that we continue to thrive as an organization that promotes a progressive foreign policy in Canada. Perhaps most of all, I'd like to thank Sarah Bowles, who's still sitting out there as a receptionist, who, along with our administrative assistant, Gray Balland, I don't think she's here with us today, together they have made this all come together. So our opening session coincides with Fridays for Future rally, as I've noted. It's scheduled to take place between 12 noon and 3 p.m. On Parliament Hill. If you wish to show your solidarity by participating in that rally during our lunch period, which goes from 12:30 to 2 p.m., please do so. But please do come back for Senator Rosa Galvez, who will be rounding out today's proceeding. Thank you very much, and I wish everyone a great conference. Over to my good colleague, Susan Tanner, for the next session.
Is this the right place for this? Yes. Okay. While we're thanking people, I'd like to thank you, Roy, for leading this process and for filling in all the spots where other people had to step aside or down, and all the various changes, chaotic changes we seem to have in our society these days. So my name is Susan Tanner, and I'm vice chair and chair of the Environment Committee of the Group of 78, and at the same time, vice chair of the Ottawa Renewable Energy Co-op, which does relate in much substance. I have held executive roles in the federal government, the provincial government, and in NGOs. But at core, I'm a social activist, and I basically just tried out a lot of different pathways to that end. I confess to this eminent group where PhDs are very common that I only have 2 masters, one in law and one in environment, but I'm told that they don't add up to a PhD. And so I am not an economist. And well, since I've retired, I've noticed one important economic principle. Time is no longer money. And when my financial advisor asks me what I bring home every month, my answer is contextual depression. Because as you heard from Roy this morning, it's really hard to watch the news these days without praying. And Roy and I used to debate actually which was going to get humankind first, nuclear war or climate change. And now it's very clear that they're coming at the same time, along with ecological collapse and the threat of future disease, more future contagious diseases. So, that's right. Happy conference. So, how to transform, or we might say bend, financial institutions towards social, economic, and planetary justice in these circumstances. So I'm delighted to introduce our opening speaker, Jim Stanford, is a real economist and one of Canada's best known and oft-quoted economists. And he's far more than a pundit. As you can see from his resume, he's the director of the Centre for Future Work, a columnist for the Toronto Star, a professor of economics at McMaster, an honorary professor in the Department of Political Economy at the University of Sydney, research chair and volunteer with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and the author of Economics for Everyone, a short guide to the economics of capitalism, which I think my children are all going to get for Christmas this year. And Jim is recognized for communicating economics accessibly, but to my mind, more importantly, he turns his brilliant mind to the practical concerns of the not so rich majority of us, a real man of the people, as compared to some of the politicians who claim that role these days. And he focuses on how to build an egalitarian, diverse, and sustainable society in which we want to live and work. So, coming to us today, direct from Australia, I give you Jim Stanford.
Susan, thank you very much. That is the best introduction I have ever had. Apart from all that gratuitous detail, your phraseology about contextual depression has me laughing, which is good. We need to laugh as much as we can these days. So anyways, folks, thank you very much, Susan and Roy and the whole team at G78 for, first of all, organizing this conference, and second of all, having me as part of it. I'm really, really honored to participate. G78 is a wonderful organization, and I followed your work for many years and been to some of your conferences, and really honored to join you today at this vital moment in human history, no doubt. And I got a glimpse of some of the folks milling around there at University of Ottawa a bit earlier, and I wish I was there with you. However, I am coming to you from Sydney, Australia. You can see out the window here, the Harbour Bridge. Okay, it's not the window, but it is the Harbour Bridge. And I will tell you, it is tomorrow here. I've traveled back in time to join you in this session because it's early Saturday morning. And every time I do that, every time I talk to people in Canada when I'm over here and I'm talking to yesterday from tomorrow, I'm always thinking I should be able to give you some stock market advice. And you can short the market or play long accordingly and make a fortune. And then, of course, donate it to good causes like the G78. So here's my secret stock market advice, insider trading. It's going to crash today. It crashed in Australia and it's going to crash in Toronto. Okay, well, actually, the markets opened half an hour ago, and you already know that. They're down 3% in half an hour because chaos reigns supreme in the international economy. And it's an absolute bitter irony, in my view, that we could survive COVID, frankly, you know, despite how horrible it was. Economically, we could survive COVID as well as we did without having a giant depression globally. We had obviously huge challenges and unemployment and so on, but we responded energetically and effectively. And now we're going to end up with something worse. And it's going to be entirely self-inflicted because of the sudden reassertion of neoliberal orthodoxy in interest rate policy and anti-inflation policy. So we're going to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, and that's clear. And I suspect Canada's already in a recession. I suspect it started this quarter, in the third quarter. Employment has declined 3 months in a row, and that has never happened in history without a recession. The U.S., by some definitions, is in recession. Europe clearly heading into a terrible recession. And we have this overarching commitment to a neoliberal goal, which is inflation targeting, which has dubious foundations to start with, but that's going to put us all in the shitter. That's a technical term in economics, put us in the shitter. That means create avoidable human and economic hardship. Okay, so that's what's about to happen. Anyways, coming to you from Sydney, I would like to say that I'm speaking to you from the traditional unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the Indigenous folk from around here, and I want to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and stress my solidarity with their struggle for self-determination. Okay, so I'm going to show a few slides. I'll just call them up right here. And away we go. And hopefully you're seeing the cover slide there. Work, climate, and finance. How do we demand and how do we pay for the fair transitions that we're going to need for workers as we address the climate crisis, which Roy so eloquently highlighted in his opening remarks. We at the Center for Future Work, we post all of our research open access there, and I'll be speaking from some work that we've published. More details of it are available on the site. And if you're joining the conversation on social media, you're welcome to post from this presentation. And there's my Twitter handle and the Center's Twitter handle, if you'd like to do that. I'm going to start from a very, very basic position, which is how do I understand work and production and economic activity in the first place? Because I think this is very important for shaping how we understand what are the environmental constraints that we face and what are the different ways that we can start to address those environmental constraints. I think it also is important for putting into perspective the role of finance in our economy any day of the week, but also what role does finance have to play in these vital economic reforms that we have to undertake, including to protect the environment. And this will probably sound a bit sort of fundamentalist, but I fervently believe that it's true, and we've had ample evidence that it is. And that is that human work, broadly and correctly defined as any productive activity, doesn't have to be paid, doesn't have to be employment. There's lots of work that goes on in the world that isn't employment or paid wage labor. But in our economy, most of the work in the formal economy is wage labor. That's one of the defining features of capitalism. But in any system, and more broadly, productive human activity or work, that sort of four-letter word, if you like, and work is a four-letter word. On Monday morning, when you're dragging your sorry asses out of bed to go and do something productive, is the driving force of value added. Human activity is the only thing that takes what we harvest from nature and transforms it into usable goods and services. And what we call capital, or tools and machinery, didn't fall from the sky like the robots in Terminator. Capital is simply an indirect form of human labor. It was produced by human labor just like any other good or service was. So we start with the gifts of nature, and we're starting to understand that those gifts are not infinite, and we have to respect them and protect them. But we still start with those gifts, including the basic ecological benefits of the land that we live on and the air that we breathe and the water we drink. But of course, also the resources that we harvest from nature that are inputs, essential inputs into everything that we produce. And then from that point on, it's all value added from our brains and our brawn. Our brawn, our capacity to do physical labor and move things. Our brains, our capacity to think and communicate and conceptualize and solve problems. And that productive human activity is the engine that drives our economy. And we have to learn how to interact with nature more sustainably. But it is going to be human activity or work that leads that interaction, and that ensures that our future interactions are sustainable and beneficial. So that's my starting point when I try to understand the interaction between work and the environment, and what it means for work and for workers. So if we face a problem of pollution and environmental degradation, resulting from many things, climate change in particular, from too much pollution of one particular set of pollutants, but there's other forms of environmental degradation that we experience in the course of our economic activity. We kind of face a basic question in terms of that relationship between productive human activity and the environment. One option, which is emphasized by those who argue for a degrowth solution, would be to reduce pollution by reducing how much work we do and how much production we undertake, and hence how much pollution. That means less work. It's going to mean less employment. It is clearly going to mean falling incomes and a reduced material standard of living for people. And for, well-off people in a well-off country, that's not a identical set. There's two different categories there. There's a lot of non-well-off people in a well-off country like Canada, and then, of course, there's billions who live in not well-off countries. To tell them that their real standard of living has to decline in order to protect the environment seems immoral, frankly, and unfeasible. And I'm also convinced that approach to trying to protect the environment by doing less work and accepting a reduced material standard of living, maybe more time off if we do it correctly, that helps, but certainly a reduced material standard of living is going to founder on strong political resistance. Another option would be to reduce pollution by doing more, not by doing less, by expanding the human activity that goes into our economy, but redirecting it in more useful ways so that we spend more of our brains and brawn, more of our time and attention and energy protecting the environment and finding more sustainable ways to extract the resources from the environment that we need in order to do anything. Every job that we do in society involves material inputs from the environment, even a massage therapist. I can't think of a job that's closer to doing something with your bare hands than massage therapy. Okay, but even a massage therapist relies on tools and raw materials and inputs that ultimately come from nature. You have to have a bench that the person lies on. You have to have massage oils that you use, otherwise it's very uncomfortable. You have to have a stereo equipment to play yoga music, and you have to have a towel to cover the client's butt. Okay, so those are all material inputs to massage, the most hands-on job or bare hands job you can think of. So in order to do those activities, but while protecting and respecting the environment and allowing us to continue on a sustainable path, we're going to have to spend more work and time and energy in order to do that, involving either more less polluting forms of the activities or putting time and energy into ameliorating and cleaning up pollution that's already there. And if we do this right, it will create all kinds of opportunity. It will create jobs. It means motivating and regulating and controlling growth, not stopping growth. if we properly define it, growth should mean just doing more work. If we again measure economic output correctly, not by stuff, but by value added through our work. And in this environment, we need to know that in this approach, if you like, to protecting the environment, we know that we can't just stop using fossil fuels in and of itself. That obviously is essential and has to happen over the next coming couple of decades. But we have to replace it with other forms of activity. Otherwise, this transition will be more difficult and displace a lot more people. And replacing one set of activities with another, it can happen by itself. It has happened by itself in the past through various unplanned transitions and chaotic transitions, but it works a lot better if you have a plan. And I would say the core takeaway of my analysis of climate transitions and labor markets is that a proactive, long-term supported plan for that transition is the absolutely critical ingredient. I can list a number of types of work that don't harm the environment. That is to say, that are relatively benign in terms of their impact on pollution and resource use. Most of them involve caring for other human beings, but also improving quality rather than quantity, and thinking of intensive modes of expanding value added rather than extensive modes. So there's lots of ways to organize work that is not polluting. There's lots of ways to organize work that actually helps the environment, such as investments in public transit, energy efficiency, retrofitting buildings, developing, obviously, a whole alternative and renewable energy system and all the technology that goes with it, cleaning up pollution and so on. And of course, we have to have another element of the strategy, which is to improve living standards without more work, and that would be the leisure time dimension of it. And for sure, reducing working hours is good both for people and society and for the environment, and should be part of the vision. So that's kind of my initial framework when I approach an issue like how do we manage the transition for energy workers in Canada. By putting people to work in those alternative activities, we can still grow the economy properly measured as the value of all the goods and services we produce with our work. That's what GDP should measure. It's not perfect, but the combined value of our work is in fact what the economy is, and we can do more of it, not less, and organize it in a way that we can get off fossil fuels in the next 20 years without one person being laid off, which sounds like an extraordinary claim, but I think is actually more doable than is often supposed. In this report that's on our website, Employment Transitions and the Phase Out of Fossil Fuels, we analyze the dimensions of the problem of transitioning away from fossil fuel work and discuss best practices for a plan that would allow that to happen without a single layoff and without undue displacement of communities. The first thing we do in that report is try to get a handle on the dimensions of the problem. And if you listened to the propaganda from obviously the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers and the Alberta government's so-called war room, this propaganda department that they have, and Pierre Poilievre and his caucus, and even sometimes from our own federal Department of Natural Resources, they come up with all kinds of inflated claims about how many people in Canada depend on the fossil fuel industry for their livelihoods, and it's absolute nonsense. If you go through and read and analyze how many Canadians actually work directly in fossil fuel production, extraction, exploration, refining, processing, and transportation, it's amazingly small. In 2019, the last full year when we did this report, it was about 160,000 Canadians out of an employed labor market at that time of 17 million. The labor market's bigger than that now. So that means the share of direct fossil fuel work was less than 1% of total employment in Canada. And what's more, across the board, that had already been falling for several years, partly because of the collapse in oil prices in 2014, but because of other trends as well. And almost every fossil fuel sector, with the exception of natural gas distribution, was shedding jobs in that period, a total of 33,000 jobs over those 5 years. So the share of employment had been declining, and it has declined further since 2019, including because of the pandemic. So it's interesting to note that pace of decline in fossil fuel employment is consistent with phasing out fossil fuel jobs in 20 years, which is the task before us. If that pace was continued, we would eliminate fossil fuel jobs in 20 years. So in a way, the transition is already occurring, but it's not occurring because we planned it and we're not supporting the people. So in the course of this decline in jobs since 2014, there's a lot of people, mostly in Alberta, who've experienced a lot of hardship because they were thrown out of jobs, not by climate policy. They were thrown out of their jobs by fossil fuel companies who didn't want them anymore because the price of oil had declined to a level where they didn't want to hire those people, and or because they'd found new technology and other modes of production that just didn't need those workers. So again, the transition is happening, and we can either do this the easy way or we can do it the hard way, like the police say on the TV shows, okay? And the hard way would be to just let it happen as a result of the profit maximizing decisions of fossil fuel companies as the world changes around them. A better way would be to plan it and support the people so that it's fair and less painful. This point about the incredibly small size of the fossil fuel industry in Canada's labour market can be reinforced if you compare it to other industries that truly are big industries. So this is the top 10 sectoral employers in Canada measured at the 2-digit level in Statistics Canada data. And the biggest one is health and social services, of course. On average, those top 10 sectors employ close to 1.5 million people each, or almost 10 times more than the complete composite of direct fossil fuel employment that we talked about. And what's more, those other industries are adding jobs as the fossil fuel sector is eliminating them. So over the 5 years that we looked at, each of those 10 sectors on average added over 100,000 jobs in those 5 years. So any one of those top 10 industries added 3 times as many jobs as disappeared from the fossil fuel sector in the same period of time. Any one of them. The biggest growing industry, of course, was healthcare, that added something like 8 times as many jobs as the fossil fuel sector lost. So the scale of the transition is small in the grand scheme of things. And frankly, over a 20-year period for an industry that loses 1% of Canada's total employment over a 20-year period is a macroeconomic non-event. It absolutely is. This is not to say that the loss of those jobs won't be important for the people who do them today in the communities where they live, unless the transition is supported. So I'm not saying this is trivial or we shouldn't care about it. We should care about it. In fact, because it's so small, we can care about it in a very, very affordable way, as I will argue. It's interesting that despite the large, financial footprint of the fossil fuel sector, it's one of the major sources of equity investment in Canada, the large political influence of the sector, the huge profits of the sector that we're seeing right now. Why does it create so few jobs? Why do so few Canadians actually work there? And the answer is in the direct nature of production in that industry. It's so incredibly capital intensive, particularly petroleum, that almost no jobs are created for each $1 million of GDP. On average, across all of those fossil fuel sectors, 1 job for every $1 million of value added. And in the economy as a whole, across the whole economy, $1 million of GDP should add 8.6 jobs. So clearly, it's a no-brainer shifting value added and production from industries that create half of a job per million to industries that create 8.6 jobs per million is going to be a winner. And the transition doesn't have to solely be transitioning from fossil fuel energy to other types of energy. I'll argue that's part of the solution, but transitioning to anything will actually be a net winner in terms of overall employment levels. The key issue, what makes this more difficult for us, if it was 1% of jobs spread evenly across the whole national economy, you wouldn't even notice it over a 20-year period. The key issue is the regional concentration of fossil fuel jobs that naturally matches the regional concentration of the fossil fuels. That's why I got a PhD in economics. I did get a PhD in economics, Susan, but I'm not sure that I accept your argument that 2 masters isn't worth a PhD. I think it's probably worth more than a PhD, especially a PhD in economics. Anyway, I got one, and I can say the reason fossil fuel work is regionally concentrated is because the oil under the ground is regionally concentrated. That's just brilliant. Anyways, the concentration, particularly in Alberta, but also Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador, is what makes it more difficult and more challenging for those jurisdictions, and more politically challenging in a divided federal system like Canada's. So you have, of course, Alberta and the influence that Alberta wields economically and politically. Now, Alberta is the most fossil fuel dependent, but even in Alberta, it's 7% of direct jobs that are dependent on fossil fuel. And that's still small. And there are other industries that are bigger. So in Alberta, the healthcare sector employs about 11% of direct employment in Alberta. It's actually more accurate to describe Alberta as a healthcare dependent province than to describe it as an oil dependent province. And so even there, highlighting the range of other industries that are available is very important to this discussion. We even looked at it at the community level, the census community level, out of something like 165 different census-defined communities in Canada. There's just a handful, a dozen, that have more than 5% of their total employment in fossil fuels. Just a handful of communities. And again, I don't say this so that therefore we don't care. What that actually says is it's feasible for the whole country to say we're going to support those communities in the course of the transition, and it's not going to cost very much money in the grand scheme of things, because there's hardly anywhere that it really can be said is genuinely dependent on fossil fuel employment. The other thing I think important to keep in mind is that the loudest defenders of fossil fuel jobs, the Jason Kennys of the world and the Pierre Poilievres of the world and the executives of the oil companies who stand up and say we care about these workers and we're going to defend their jobs, are the ones who throw the workers under the bus whenever it suits the bottom line of the fossil fuel industry. We've seen this big time in the industry's adjustment through the reduced oil prices since 2014. Now, of course, we're in a different situation for the time being. It won't last. But you've seen both employers cutting employment, cutting wages, having lockouts, mechanizing work, contracting out work, hiring temporary foreign migrants to come and do the work because they're cheaper. And you've seen the Alberta government, the great defender of energy jobs, doing things like cutting their overtime protection and their workers' compensation. So we have to absolutely call bullshit. Bullshit, that's a technical term in economics. It means hypothesis unsubstantiated by empirical verification. Okay, we have to call bullshit on the Alberta government and the oil company executives who stand up and say they're defending oil workers. They aren't. Oil workers are a disposable productive input to them. And we aren't helping fossil fuel workers by perpetuating the myth that there's a long-term future for this industry. That's not helping them. We've seen, for example, again, in most fossil fuel sectors, a big decline in real incomes since 2014 because of those cutbacks in austerity and belt tightening, in contrast to modest real wage gains for other workers, at least until the current inflation broke out. Now, of course, real wages everywhere are going backwards. A key insight to keep in mind while we're thinking about these transitions is the fact that the labor market is constantly changing. And I think this is really underappreciated, including among progressives, how flexible and fluid and constantly in motion the overall labor market is. We're used to seeing, the monthly labor market report from Statistics Canada that says, potentially on average, 30,000 net jobs were created in Canada in the last month. That's a typical number. Nowadays, it's got a minus sign in front of it, unfortunately, because of this recession that we're heading into. And we don't understand exactly how much change added up under the surface to that relatively small change in the overall net number of employed. The Statistics Canada doesn't do this a lot, but they have a bit of data on gross employment changes rather than the net figures that are reported each month. And it's more like 600 or 700,000 Canadians change their jobs every month, which is a huge number. And then over the course of a year, it means a very significant portion of Canadians change their employment status or their job or where they work or the nature of their job. And so this ongoing change is actually very helpful if we can find a way to harness those ongoing adjustments towards the goal of phasing out of fossil fuels without huge pain to particular workers or particular companies. And our report listed a whole set of those dimensions of ongoing flexibility. One of them, obviously, is retirement. Fossil fuel workers on average are a bit older than the Canadian workforce, and more than half of them are going to retire in the next 20 years. And that is the easiest way to facilitate a transition. We know that from other transitions that we've experienced. But there's other transitions happening as well. People moving from one province to another, people moving from one occupation or industry to another. On any given point in time, 20% of the fossil fuel workforce has been in their job for less than a year. So if we can find ways to harness and take advantage of those ongoing transitions, and particularly by encouraging exit in a gradual, voluntary way over time, and not refilling those positions, not backfilling those positions with new people who are essentially tricked into coming into the industry despite the fact it has no future, then that ongoing process of change can do most of the heavy lifting. Just as a simple example, I said 20% of the workforce has been there for less than a year. Let's say 10% instead of 20%, but even just 10% leaving in a year, if they aren't refilled, leads to at least 80% of the workforce leaving over the next 20 years, which is the timetable to try to get to net zero. So harnessing that change is very important. And this is why the advanced planning and timetables, firm timetables, and ways to allow people to leave without having the industry refill all the positions is going to be so critical. Where are people going to work if they're not working in the fossil fuel sector? Well, the short answer is anywhere. Now, it is certainly the case that renewable energy jobs can be an important and valuable part of the solution. There's going to be a lot of work involved in wind power, solar power, geothermal, energy conservation, and all the other things that come together in a renewable energy system. Probably a net gain. Renewable energy projects tend to be quite capital intensive as well. So they're not the biggest job creators, but they will probably create more jobs on net than the fossil fuel industry loses. So in that regard, we'll lose 1% of the labor force that's currently employed in direct fossil fuel work, and we'll gain probably a little bit more than 1% in renewable energy sectors. But this idea that we're going to solve the problem by taking workers from the oil sands and putting them to work building windmills, I think is a bit simplistic for all kinds of reasons. The oil sands workers might not want to build windmills. They might not have the skills to build windmills. The windmills are probably not going to be built in Fort McMurray. So for all those reasons, it's better to cast this transition net much more widely across the whole labor market. All the rest of the labor market, the other 98%, consists of places that fossil fuel workers could go if they had support for relocation and retraining and adjustment. And if we plan this right, most of them won't have to go anywhere because most will retire by the time fossil fuels are phased out of the economy, again, if we do it right. So this is where the idea of a transition plan, a supported long-term transition plan, starts to look very, very appealing. If we were to take those 160,000 jobs, direct jobs in fossil fuels, and phase them out gradually over 20 years, you're looking at 8,000 jobs reduced per year. Well, Canada's economy produces 8,000 jobs every 10 days. That's net, not those large gross flows. So again, that's a macroeconomic non-event, as long as we give people notice and support for those transitions. More than half of the 8,000 people will leave to retire. So the actual transition problem is less than half, 4,000 jobs a year or less, where you actually need to support someone to take up another job. So you could when I was in the union movement, I helped participated in negotiating all kinds of restructuring arrangements and packages and severance programs. You could have a gold-plated adjustment package, $250,000 for each one of those 4,000 jobs lost, for relocation, retraining, early retirement, other voluntary severance. You could give them an insurance program where if they took a job that paid less in the oil industry, they'd get compensated for the difference. You could do all kinds of things with $250,000 per worker. That's $1 billion a year, a big $1 billion a year, in the context of an energy transition that is going to cost tens of billions of dollars every year, or hundreds of billions of dollars in total. So the properly supported and planned transition, particularly if we take advantage of the ability of people to move around between sectors and between locations, will be small potatoes in the grand scheme of things. There's lots of examples from around the world of how to do this right. Some examples from Canada. This is, of course, the picture of the German coal miners. Germany phased out its black coal industry over a 20-year period. Nice period of time there. 80,000 jobs gone, not one layoff. So this is not utopian thinking. There was a whole multidimensional support package. Workers were given the right, younger workers were given the right to move to other locations in the coal industry, while older workers at any location, not just those that were closing, at any location could be given an incentive to retire. So that way you minimize the number of people who are unemployed. You also were supporting people to move to other occupations or even other industries. Part of the package also was a community development investment system, whereby the towns and communities where the black coal mining was most important were given money to invest in and develop diversified industries, including things that had nothing to do with energy. And here's a key point: to make this happen, to allow the planned gradual closure of the whole industry, the German government bought out the coal industry. So that was handy. They bought out the industry in order to shut it down, because that allowed them to close the facilities in a way that was rational and less disruptive, rather than according to the profit loss calculations of the owners of each of those facilities. Now Germany is going to try the same thing with phasing out the light coal that they use for power generation. And now, of course, that's all been disrupted by the war in Ukraine and the cutoff of natural gas to Germany. So we'll see where that goes. But the lesson of the first phase was very, very valuable. Similar approaches have been tried in Netherlands and Spain. Ontario Hydro phased out its entire coal-generated power system over 7 years. Again, plant by plant, allowing mobility between the plants, encouraging senior people to retire at all locations, not just the closing ones, and that left room for the younger people to move to another job, done without one layoff. So the idea here of planning it, setting a timetable, sticking to it, and then supporting people as the timetable comes along is entirely doable. So the key ingredients of a plan are to, first of all, set the plan, set the timetable, and stick to it. Have that end target of phase out, say in 20 years, but an annual timeline so that you're moving towards it. You're not just back-end loading it and waiting for a collapse at the end of it. Facilitate mobility between locations within the fossil fuel sector as the sector is gradually reduced in its activity, and then also mobility between occupations and between locations. There's all kinds of people, I can assure you, in Fort McMurray who would love to move back to where they came from if they were supported in doing so, including with retraining for another job and including support for the real estate issue that's created when everyone leaves a town. It becomes very hard to sell your house for a very decent price. Nowadays, of course, with falling house prices, that's going to be even more of an issue. Lots of support could be given to those small number of communities that genuinely depend on fossil fuel work in order to diversify and develop other industries. Even a place like Fort McMurray, which is a challenge because it's so remote, could be supported with public service institutions or investments in non-fossil fuel resource sectors and so on. So I would like to see, and I proposed this to the federal commission that was looking at this just transition plan, which so far has been pretty mealy-mouthed. I proposed make a commitment to $1 billion a year, and the participants to say no forced layoffs and full income protection for people who are affected by the transition, and it would change the political discourse completely if that threat of job loss, the full exaggerated threat of job loss, was taken off of table. I'm cognizant that I think I'm running a bit short on time, and I want to leave some time for questions. So I'm going to zoom through the last bit of the presentation where I tried to tie it into the finance discussion that I know is the theme for this year's G78 conference, which is what role does finance play in facilitating this transition? I, of course, have had a long infatuation with the financial sector and talking about it being a kind of superficial level on the economy and not a source of real value creation. Instead, it's an arena for speculation. And it's important for us to keep this in mind when we're thinking about finance and the relationship to transitions and changes in the real economy. Stock markets were not put on earth to raise money for growing companies. In fact, in the last 2 decades, they've been a way for owners to take money out of companies. And you don't reward a company by buying its shares. You don't punish it by not buying its shares. And you can't starve an industry. You couldn't put fossil fuel industry out of business by even a whole army of ethical investors refusing to buy its shares, because they could just raise the money through private equity and other sources. So, and the same goes for the role of pension funds. Pension funds are big players in the stock market, but they don't control the stock market, not remotely. These are things I wrote about. I saw Bruce Campbell on the line. Bruce and I worked on this, my very first CCPA book, Paper Boom, ages ago, and I think we should reissue it, Bruce, because so much of these arguments about the superficial and unproductive nature of the financial sector are as true today, or more so, as they were then. The same goes for this whole idea of ethical investment. Oops, I'm sorry, I've got a slide repeated there. This is ethical investment from the Raytheon Technologies department. This just shows you how shallow this ESG argument can be sometimes. This is Raytheon boasting that they're produced the most environmentally friendly anti-aircraft missile. And of course, there's all kinds of other ways that ethical investment, sometimes a contradiction in terms like military intelligence, is kind of trite and feel good, but doesn't actually do anything. Our goal is not to have a sense about what we invest in. On the other hand, I do accept that there's a cultural discourse that goes on around social license and the legitimacy of these firms, and pension funds and other platforms in the investment community can be important ways to target the irresponsibility of the fossil fuel industry and demand better standards, including more transparent reporting on climate change risks of those companies, and challenging the greenwash that they will attempt to foist on people. I think divestment and boycotts of shares can be effective more as a political device than actually starving those companies of capital. It's a bad thing for the fossil fuel industry when foundations and universities and so on publicly state that this is an industry that is bad. That hurts the fossil fuel industry's legitimacy and political influence, no doubt about it. We can advocate through the financial sector for clearer regulations and targets, and try to think about ways that we can use private finance as well as, I think, public finance to support investments in the energy transition, including alternative energy systems and so on. So, Roy, I think Roy and Susan, I'll stop it there. If we've got a couple minutes for discussion and questions, I'd be glad to hear it. I am ultimately very optimistic in the sense that this is something that's possible to do. We can absolutely, as a society, move our resources, and in particular our people, from doing something right now that's destructive and must stop, and move them into doing things that are useful and that we need more of. Not just renewable energy systems, but care and service and other types of production. like housing construction, affordable housing construction, and with an appropriate focus on the ultimate source of value added is our people, and putting those people to work doing what we need more of can be the driver of something that's good for the environment, but also good for employment and opportunity. And with a recession about to hit us, and we may already be in one, and all of the economic and political fractures that are going to happen in this recession, being able to come out with a very ambitious and reasonable plan to put Canadians to work doing something good, I think will be more important than ever over the next couple of years. So thanks to G78 for starting this discussion and for having me as part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. That was a really positive way to start our discussion. I'm just wondering if you're available for questions, for a few
Absolutely.
questions now. Yeah. Okay, great. So please be patient with us because we're trying to figure out how to do that in a hybrid system. So if you have questions in the room, please signal me, and someone else, I hope, is going to be dealing with the questions that come over the internet. But before we start, I wanted to mention, since I mentioned co-ops at the beginning, that it is another way of investing in alternative energy, is the kind of the co-op that the Ottawa Renewable Energy Co-op is, which is that you invest in other people putting solar collectors on schools and storage sheds and things, and then receive a return on your investment in the cooperative. So I think that we have been, I'm just encouraging people to think about co-ops and other community structures for doing some of this alternative work that we need to be doing for the future. So anybody with questions in the room that they'd like to address to Jim? Roy has one, but he's supposed to be doing the internet. Here we go.
Jim, that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. I'm just wondering if you're underestimating the nature of the challenge. If you include, in addition to the fossil fuel sector per se, all the other sectors that are carbonized to one degree or another, and decarbonization embraces more than just getting out of fossil fuels. It also includes, decarbonizing the industrial sector, steel and cement and all of those carbon producers. So how do you incorporate those into your analysis?
Yeah, I think, Roy, that's a fair point. The fossil fuel sector isn't the only source of pollution, obviously. In the course of developing alternatives to fossil fuels for all uses, including almost anything in industry can be done without fossil fuels. The challenges now are the coke in steel production and some of the things that go on in cement. Other than that, most of the carbon in industry is used for energy, so we just have to find another way of giving them the energy. And there's all kinds of evidence that you can run heavy industry on renewable energy, no problem. There's some great examples of that here in Australia, running mining and refining with renewable energy. The other one that we're sometimes accused of underestimating is the role of indirect employment. So the statistics that I had on fossil fuels are the direct employment, but then they'll say, what about all the spin-off jobs that depend on it? Everything in the supply chain, the construction and transportation and other services, everything in the downstream end of oil communities, from the Tim Hortons, who depends on oil workers coming in to buy coffee, to home builders and everything else. And again, I discount that any of those activities are fundamentally dependent on fossil fuel. What you need is something else to replace fossil fuel as the stimulus for that activity, both upstream in the supply chain and downstream in consumer goods and services industries. There'll be someone else spending money in Tim Hortons on coffee. I can assure you, Canadians of every industry go to Tim Hortons to spend their money on coffee, myself included. So as long as we're filling in the economic space that's left as fossil fuels phase out with other types of investment and activity that stimulates those same spin-off benefits, then I don't think the indirect jobs are a problem. Some of the ways we use fossil fuels obviously have to transform. The auto industry is a good one. So we're going to still drive cars, absolutely. And they're going to be cars that run on something other than fossil fuels. We see them now already. There will be some employment implications. It's not benign. The types of jobs and possibly the number of jobs in manufacturing and certainly maintaining electric vehicles. They don't need nearly as much maintenance as internal combustion vehicles. So there are going to be some challenges in those areas as well. So I think your point that I haven't covered the whole ground in the transition is valid. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. And over by the coffee.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for speaking to us today. I just have a question regarding your mention of Germany's transition. I thought that was a very interesting point, and you mentioned how they've been having some issues due to the Ukraine conflict. I was just wondering how you would propose that we transition labor in order to not lose our international strategic advantage in regard to fossil fuels, and how that creates an internal issue in terms of prices internally, domestically. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure I caught I understood your point on the last bit. Our international strategic advantage, could you explain what you're referring to there? I'm sorry.
Sure. If we transition our fossil fuels industry, we'll lose our international strategic advantage in terms of like producing those commodities. And it might leave us in a vulnerable position similar to that in which Germany is in, that is now experiencing higher energy prices, higher prices for heating their homes, things like that.
I see. If we stopped producing it but kept consuming it, then we'd be in a risky position, I think is maybe what you're suggesting. Yes, we would have to stop consuming those things as well. And that's part of the energy transition. Part of the energy transition is to stop producing fossil fuels, but it has to be accompanied by measures to stop using it elsewhere in our economy by building out renewable energy sources and, as Roy said, decarbonizing the other activities in our economy. And once we've done that, then we'll be much less vulnerable to the sorts of international shocks that we're seeing right now. So even though we produce a lot of petroleum and export a lot of petroleum, we're very vulnerable to what happens in the rest of the world. That's why Canadians are paying $2 a litre for gasoline that was produced in Canada, refined in Canada, and sold in Canada. Putin had nothing to do with the gasoline that we're buying. Nothing. But because of how we've organized our energy market and tied it to those world disrupted events, we're hit by it as well. And if we weren't using those commodities, we'd be almost insulated from what's going on. Just like someone who drives an electric vehicle today already doesn't care about the price of gasoline. So ultimately, your point is right. We have to stop the consumption of fossil fuels as well as the production. But once we've done both, we're going to be in a much more stable situation, because the fluctuations in the price of sunshine, wind, and geothermal heat are negligible. The price is still zero.
Thank you, Jim. Now Roy is going to read out a question from the internet.
We have time for two more questions. Robin Collins asks, Jim, can you outline in more detail why ethical investment to remove funds from problem sectors isn't that effective economically, even if it is politically?
Right. Yeah. Oh, fair point. Ethical investment. I said it's a contradiction in terms, kind of like military intelligence, perhaps, or perhaps progressive conservative. Oh, wait, that's not a contradiction in terms anymore, because they dropped the progressive, didn't they? That's right. They solved their internal dilemma. It is often felt that you reward a company when you buy its shares, and it's not how it works. When you buy the share, almost all the time you're buying it from someone else, not from the company. You're buying it from whoever owned the share first. And so, all you're doing is transferring the ownership. And by not buying the shares, you're just meaning someone else will buy the shares. If the underlying activity is legal and profitable, capital markets will find a way to get the money there. And I have yet to see an industry that was legal and profitable but unethical driven out of existence because individual shareholders and ethical investors wouldn't buy the shares. You can easily have the money raised through private equity now. And financial markets are very, very sophisticated at finding ways to raise capital to take advantage of profitable opportunities. So at the end of the day, the solution is going to be to stop those industries being profitable and legal. And that means regulations on how much they can produce and requirements that they, their pollution is capped. This is the debate that's underway right now in Canada, and so on. So, in fact, if you actually got enough investors together to sell all their shares in, say, Suncor or some other big polluter, on the open market, that would presumably reduce the share price of that company. But if it was still profitable, that creates a buying opportunity for not even an anti-ethical investor, even just an agnostic investor, to come along and say this is a more profitable opportunity. It's a more favorable price earnings ratio, and they would snap up that offering. So, I've mellowed on this topic. I used to be, in a way, even more critical of ethical investment in my fiery youth. I do recognize the value of the battle of ideas and the battle over legitimacy. And I think that the divestment movement and other campaigns, ethical investment campaigns like that, play a useful role in highlighting why these industries are destructive and why they need to change. But it will be that political battle, not starving them of capital somehow by not buying their shares, that wins the day in the end, in my judgment as an economist.
Thank you, Jim. We have time for one more question from the floor, and that's Manfred Bienefeld.
Manfred, nice to hear from you, my friend. I hope you're well.
I am well, and it's great to hear your presentation, Jim, as always. Entertaining and clear as one could hope. But partly, Jim, because it's so clear and because it seems so simple, maybe that means we need to focus on the question of, I'm not suggesting you haven't thought about this, but I just wanted to suggest that where your presentation leads is for us to think about how one needs to change the incentive structures, which currently make that transition, which you have set out, so difficult. And the second part of that question is, there's another element that needs to be sorted out, which is that not all jobs are comparable in the sense that Canadians' consumption patterns are, as we know, very import intensive, partly because Canada has abandoned any idea of industrial strategy. And so we haven't built up any high value added activities that could earn foreign exchange. So when we talk about shifting out of a sector like this, we need to make sure that that balance on the external front is maintained.
Oh, those are both great points, Manfred. Thank you very much. And I was surprised that you didn't quote anything from the Financial Times in asking that question. I always associate Manfred with very pithy quotes from the Financial Times, and I hope you're still reading it. In fact, Manfred, I don't know if you remember once, but you gave a presentation where you quoted yourself quoting from the Financial Times. And that has stuck in my memory as someone who's consistent. Okay, anyways, the meat of your question is, number one, the incentive structures. This is a good way to chase capital out of that industry by making the incentives in that industry less appealing, making it less profitable, and making the incentives in other industries more appealing, particularly, say, renewable energy, with lots of subsidies or other incentives to move into renewable energy. And then you'll see capital move pretty quick. There's a great epic battle happening right here in Australia. One of the giant private utilities, Australia's got this bizarre, terrible, privatized, fragmented electricity industry. one of the companies that relies on coal-fired electricity is facing hostile investor activism from other private investors who say the profitability of the company will be improved if they move into renewable energy. They're not doing it because it's ethical. They're doing it because it's profitable. And that's a good example of how the incentives, a carbon tax is obviously a negative incentive as well, or regulations that cap production. And incentives at the consumption level as well make a difference. So you're absolutely right. And those are ways to undermine the profitability and hence dynamism of those sectors. You're also absolutely right to say not all jobs are equal. And there is a tradition to see fossil fuel jobs as relatively good jobs in terms of certainly the level of income in some of them, not all, in some of them. And that has changed over the last few years. They aren't as good by that definition as they used to be. But average incomes in fossil fuels are still certainly higher than in the rest of the economy. So part of the transition has to be making it more appealing for workers to go to those other jobs. That means lifting the standards in those other jobs through higher minimum wages and unionization and so on. I think there's potential in this income insurance idea as well. If you had a fossil fuel worker with 10 years left in their normal working life and they took a job in another industry that didn't pay as much, top up their income so that it's a wash for them. And the impact, the cost of that is quite modest. That was part of the German system. It's part of what's been proposed in the US as well. So I think that's another way to make those alternative jobs look relatively more appealing. And I think I even read that once in the Financial Times.
Thank you very much, Jim. This has been a great discussion, but we do have to move on to our next presenter, whom Manfred is moderating. And I don't know whether we're wishing you good evening now in Australia. What time is it for you?
It is 1 o'clock in the morning. So how about time for a nightcap, Jim?
All right.
That's what you can wish me.
Wishing you a wonderful nightcap, and thank you very much, particularly for presenting in the middle of the night to us. Thank you very much.
It was my greatest pleasure. Thank you for having me, and good luck with the rest of the conference.
It's my great pleasure to introduce you to our audience, both here at Ottawa University and online. It really is true that you don't need much of an introduction, and the bio is there, and time is short. Richard has been the director of the globalization and development part of UNCTAD for many years. And for those of us struggling in the trenches trying to fight against the Washington Consensus during the period when it almost completely dominated the development debate, that part of UNCTAD was an incredibly important lifeline because they provided a more neutral and a more thoughtful voice, and Richard's role in all of this, I think, was really, really important and continues to be important. Richard has also co-authored a book recently, which it deals with the topic he's talking about today. So anybody who wants to follow up the arguments that he's about to present can obviously go to that book to get the arguments fleshed out. I just want to say that the issue that Richard is addressing, to me, goes to the heart of the economic debate in general. My argument for many years has been that there should never have been a discipline called economics. because all economic issues are simultaneously and integrally political economy issues. And nowhere is this more evident than in the area of finance. And just to make that point in a very pithy way, there's a quote from Keynes, which I think is incredibly prescient and profound, when Keynes says that the interest rate in a country is determined nationally, then no society is in a position to pursue its own favorite social experiments. And if you think about this comment, this very pithy comment, what it's telling you is that the interest rate doesn't just reflect economic dimensions, doesn't just reflect productivity, demand, and so on. It reflects the way a society has chosen to do the trade-offs between the social demand for efficiency, which is real, and the social demand for many other objectives, protection of child labor, environmental protection, and so on and so on. But the moment you understand that, then you understand that obviously there has to be a political mechanism to determine what that trade-off should be. And unless you are optimistic enough to think that that could happen in a meaningful way at the global level, you are then forced to think about the fact that that choice, that decision about how those trade-offs should be made is something that needs to be determined at the level of societies, hopefully democratically. But in order for that to happen, there have to be societies, first of all, meaning societies whose members identify as members of those societies and therefore assume certain responsibilities and agree to abide by the results of elections that are peaceful ways of resolving differences. If such societies don't exist, then there is no way of determining those trade-offs. The second thing that you then have to realize, that those societies, they're thus able to make decisions about those trade-offs, need to have the sovereign power to implement those decisions. And that's the nexus. When you think about it, that's the nexus that will tell you that political economy is the only topic, it is the only subject that we should be concerned about, and the nexus that Richard has addressed in that book so eloquently, namely, we need a framework, a global framework, which accepts global interdependence, which is obviously a fact of life, but which creates space for societies to function in a meaningful way within that framework, in a cooperative way, allowing members of those societies to make those choices. And if you think about all of that, you'll understand that without those conditions being met, democracy is a word that has no content. So with that, with those introductory remarks, Richard, I'd like to invite you to, you're taking on a huge task, of course. It's a short time, the topic is huge. I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Manfred, and thank you to Roy and the G78 for the invitation. I hope I can live up to that introduction, Manfred. That was a very eloquent but demanding way of introducing what I have to say, which to some extent I hope will also very much complement what Jim also was talking about in terms of the international dimension and support that is needed to complement the kinds of policies that are needed to address the inequities and environmental challenges that everybody is currently facing. Basically, I want to very briefly look at where we are right now in terms of the policy, the way in which policy is going. I want to look at some of the underlying systemic forces that have got us into this situation. And then I want to address the kind of architecture at the international level that I think, and the work we've been doing in UNCTAD suggests is needed to deal with the multiple crises that we are currently facing. I guess it's slightly ironic that I would have a quote from the Financial Times as here. I didn't realize that was part of the narrative. But what I put together here is 3 quotes that kind of over the course of the last couple of years that somehow suggest the challenge that we face. The first one is from the Financial Times. I'm not going to read these quotes, about coming immediately after the COVID shock, and a very bold statement that the FT made about the need for radical change and for redistribution measures, a bigger role for the state, etc. You can read that quote there. Picked up, I think, a year later, still lingering. The idea that we had to do things very differently than we had been for the previous 30 years. In the G7 communique that came out of Cornwall in the June of last year, and the whole language around building back better, and the building back better world that we heard from the luminaries in Cornwall. And then within the space really of another year less, we now end up where we are with Jay Powell saying that we have to get rid of inflation at any cost, and essentially overturning the whole litany of commitments that were made under the rubric of building back better. And in a way, that's not so much a dramatic turn. It's very much a return to the dominant way of thinking, I think, that we've all experienced over the course of the last 20, 30 years. I mean, Powell, in his presentation, thinks he knows what caused inflation, and he thinks he has the tools to deal with it. And it's a very simple and rather crude perspective around the idea that too much money has been chasing too few goods, and that by raising interest rates and making it more costly for households and businesses to borrow money, then somehow we will very rapidly bring down the inflation that we've been experiencing and return to normal. To some extent, as is hinted at in Powell's quote, he understands that this could be a potentially painful process. He doesn't explain that the people who will be hurt the hardest by this are not the people who are responsible for the inflation in the first place. In the case of advanced economies, it has an inevitable consequence of laying off workers. And in a world, in the case of the United States, where 60% of workers are living paycheck to paycheck, it's pretty clear that it won't be people like Jay Powell who will be experiencing the pain that he is inflicting. But of course, in this highly integrated, as Manfred said, and dollarized world, the action by the Federal Reserve will, of course, lead to the exporting of deflationary policies. Other central banks already in the advanced economies have been forced to replicate that move, even in countries where inflation is not a particularly significant problem. That's to some extent true of Canada. It's also true of the country I'm in Switzerland, where central banks have already begun to replicate the moves of the Federal Reserve. And it's also happening, of course, in developing countries where the consequences of these monetary actions will be even more severe. The threat of triggering a vicious deflationary circle, I think, is particularly acute. We're already seeing that hitting many developing countries with devastating consequences, both socially, economically, and in some cases politically. So I think that's the kind of world that we are living in, and it's a world in which particularly in advanced economies, central banks have essentially been left to dominate the economic policy agenda. Politicians have taken a backseat over the last 20 or 30 years. That's part of the neoliberal tide. And central bankers have become far more important in dictating the policy line that we've seen in advanced economies. Now, the claim, of course, is that independent and technocratic institutions, such as central banks, will produce the best and the swiftest adjustments that are needed to ensure macroeconomic balance. I think it's clear that in terms of the impacts that I've just described, that is not the case, and that right now, in terms of the situation that are facing many policymakers, we see at least in the work that we do, we see a global economy that has become weighed down by huge amounts of debt, both public and private, with footloose capital, a major source of volatility and uncertainty in the global economy. There are clearly serious supply side imbalances. That's part of the contributing factor to inflation that we've seen in recent months. There are very deep distributional divisions within countries that the inflation, the policies used to tackle inflation will almost certainly exaggerate. We're in a world of very sluggish investment, and the global economy is now slowing down much quicker than many of us thought 6 months or a year ago. And in that world, there is simply no way that hiking interest rates at the pace that is now happening will produce a soft landing. And the real danger now is that we will see the global economy crash much more harder than we thought was likely and indeed want to see. And of course, for the work that we do in an organization like UNCTAD, the kind of sad situation that we have to deal with is that the multilateral system that was set up essentially to prevent these kinds of deflationary episodes from taking hold are not fit for purpose. The absence of policy coordination, the absence of a meaningful financial safety net has become quite apparent under these circumstances. And it's, I think, very important for us to ask how we got into this. What are the underlying systemic forces that have created this highly unequal, unstable, and insecure world? And it's not just a question of ideas, I think, that is important here. It's very much ideas are important, but interests are also extremely important. It's very difficult to find the right word to describe the kind of systemic changes that we've seen over the course of the last 20 or 30 years. Some people refer to the financialized world. Other people refer to rentier capitalism. We, of course, all talk about the rise of neoliberalism as a dominant paradigm. To some extent, I think all these forces are at play in what we have used to describe the last 30 years as one of a hyper-globalized world. And very quickly, the kinds of forces that have created this this hyper-globalized situation. Just to give some idea of those three forces: financial, and the rise of finance as a dominant force shaping the international political economy, I think, is familiar to everybody here. It's finance, much more than trade, has dominated the shaping of the global economy. You can see this in the chart on the right-hand side of this slide, which compares the growing weight of trade in the global economy, the blue line, with the growing weight of finance in terms of financial assets and liabilities as a percentage of global GDP. And finance has been this particularly dominant force over this period. That's coincided with the rise of private asset accumulation, which has taken place at a tremendous pace, even in the period since the global financial crisis, which was a period when everyone expected to some kind of reining in of the financial sector, given that it was the factor that contributed to the global financial crisis. The opposite, in many respects, has happened, as the figure in the middle of this slide shows, in terms of the rise of private wealth over the course of the last 10 years, and it's increased during COVID too. And overseeing that has been the emergence of independent central banks with a singular focus on inflation targeting as their policy goal. And the final figure in this slide indicates the rise of inflation targeting central banks, most of which are independent of immediate political influence over the course of the last 30 years in both developed and developing countries. So the financialization story, I think, which I guess you will all be talking about in greater detail over the course of the conference, is one that we're all familiar with. It's also gone hand in hand with I think something we're all familiar with. It tends to get less attention than the rise of unregulated financial actors, but the emergence of corporate power across all sectors of the economy, I think, is something that we need to talk about more. The two forces are intimately connected. The rise of global mergers and acquisitions over this time, although it moves in waves, is a feature of this of the rise of highly concentrated markets, with corporations with increasing amounts of economic and to some extent political power, but also various measures of concentration that have been developed. These are from work that we did in UNCTAD 3 or 4 years ago. They're a little bit dated, but I think they show this broad tendency of increasingly concentrated markets, of rising monopoly power, and to some extent a real bifurcation in the structure of corporations between very large corporations that do hold a very tenacious grip over the markets in which they're involved, and the much smaller firms that are subordinate to these large corporations. And that has an international dimension, of course, with the spread of global value chains, where the lead firms are by and large concentrated in the advanced economies, and the more vulnerable supplier firms are found in the developing world. And a feature, I think, that we've tried to emphasize in our work on this over recent years is that in this world of mounting corporate power, rent-seeking behavior by corporations has become as important, if you like, as the process of generating what economists refer to as normal profits. And the final chart on this one on this slide is our attempt to measure the rise of what we call surplus profits, above normal profits, amongst the largest firms, some of the largest firms in the global economy, and this notion of super profits or surplus profits generated by monopoly positions in the economy has become, we think, a very significant feature of the global economy over the course of recent years. And there is this there's a very close, I think, interaction between the rise of finance and the rise of corporate power. There's a figure that I don't have here, but in work by Bill Lazonick, who looked at the companies in the S&P 500, I think over the first 15 years of this century, and estimated that of their total profits of companies in the S&P 500, $9 out of $10 of profit was used either for buying back shares or paying out dividends, which left less than $1 for the reinvestment of those earnings into a productive investment. And I think that notion of a disconnect between the financialized and the real economy is a very poignant one when trying to understand the dynamics of this hyperglobalized world. The last element I think that we focused on, of course, is the one that we've already been talking about: the rise of neoliberalism and the endless austerity that has tended to accompany and the squeezing of fiscal space available to governments in both the developed and the developing world, and to some extent this figure on government spending on goods and services over the last few decades is obviously, again, there are fluctuations, but the trend is very much downwards, with one exception, at least one exception, one notable exception. In the slide on the right-hand side, the blue line is, of course, the spending of China, government spending by China, which has actually been on a significant rising trend. So these are the kind of forces that we see as having shaped this highly unequal and unstable global economy over the last 2 or 3 decades. And just to give you the kind of sense of the problems that has generated, our focus, as I say, is on developing countries, but I think these are ubiquitous features of this hyper-globalized world that true of developed and developing countries. That generates a very different narrative from the kind of Panglossian view of these changes that has been propagated by many economists in the narrow sense of the term, and many international bodies that see in these forces a very benign outcomes in terms of improving efficiency, the benefits of competition, the rise of entrepreneurship, a whole language that we think really does not capture the stresses and fractures that currently we think characterize the global economy. One, of course, that is becoming more and more apparent and more dangerous at the moment is the rise in the level of indebtedness in the global economy over the course of the last 4 decades. That's true in the world as a whole, where we're in excess of $300 trillion of debt in both developed and developing countries, but also the rise in emerging and developing countries over the course of the last 3 or 4 decades has been significant. And it's been significant not just in terms of public debt, which is often where people focus, but very much in terms of private debt, and that's been on a much sharper increase than public debt, certainly in developing countries, but I think in advanced economies as well. And levels of debt distress have now peaked in many countries, and we're seeing the consequences of that in terms of defaults that are already taking place as a consequence of the additional stresses that have been imposed, first of all, by the COVID shock, and subsequently by the consequences of the war in Ukraine and Sri Lanka and Lebanon and Zambia and other countries are now in default, and a growing number of countries are increasingly close to defaulting on their existing debt, with huge consequences for lives and livelihoods in the countries that do get hit. Sorry, that was one of the second. So that problem of indebtedness, I think, is a profound one in the contemporary global economy. The instability of capital flows that has been a feature of financialization is one that we've talked about a lot in the work that we do in UNCTAD. We know how unstable these flows are. They are short-term in nature. They are footloose in character, and they can flip in and out of countries very quickly with quite devastating consequences. And the sense of instability, I think, that many countries in the South face is captured in this chart on net capital flows to low and middle income countries over the course of the last 20 years or so. And that volatility, of course, makes it very difficult for countries to take a longer term perspective on the kinds of challenges that they face, and can subject them to very rapid turnarounds in terms of their growth performance as investor confidence is sapped and capital flows out of countries, having secondary effects on a country's exchange rate, and which is now happening, of course, in the consequence of the current downturn in the global economy and the actions of the Fed in a very significant way, with countries seeing 10 or 20% declines in their currencies, with countries having borrowed extensively in dollars. This is a profound shock that is happening right now in countries. So that sense of instability, I think, is a profound one that we're watching in the global economy. I think one of the most and one of the least, I think, addressed issues in the forces that have come out of this hyperglobalized world is that whilst finance has mushroomed, financial flows have mushroomed over this period, the rates of real capital investment, capital formation in buildings and machines, human capital, has either been stagnant or declining over this same period. And so the big sell of this financialized world, that it was going to create a more efficient and dynamic investment climate, is clearly not taking place in either developed economies or the vast majority of emerging economies, again, with the exception of China, which is an exception to many of the things that I've been saying here, and itself needs to be addressed, of course. I don't have time to do that. But that disconnect, again, between the financial sides of the economy and the real sides of the economy, I think is very apparent from the figures that we have in this chart on finance here as measured by total external assets and liabilities. For the world, these are figures, aggregate figures, obviously, and the blue line for capital formation. And that is a profound challenge, I think, for all countries in the global economy as we face the climate crisis and the delivery in developing countries of the sustainable development goals, which can only be delivered if rates of, in the way that I think Jim talked about in his presentation, can only be delivered through higher rates of capital formation. And clearly the current environment is not delivering that in any way, shape or form. Another feature of this hyperglobalized world that I think, again, I'm sure is familiar to all of you, is the levels of inequality that have emerged alongside this financialized and highly indebted world. And there are different ways of presenting inequality. We've chosen a particular focus that I think that has been neglected, which is to look at the inequality from the functional income side rather than the household side. So that's the distribution between wages, profits, and rents. And I think there was a famous, I guess many of you know, the work of Branko Milanovic, who came up with an elephant graph to describe the distribution of global income which had a beneficial side to it in the growing share of China and India in the global economy. I think this is a particularly telling chart in terms of our story, which shows the rising share of transnational corporations' profits in the global economy, and the scissor that goes in the opposite direction, which is the share of labor income in the global economy. And there has been this very noticeable trend at the aggregate level, but also across most countries, of a declining share of labor income in GDP over the period in which we've seen the forces of finance and corporate power take hold of the global dynamic. So the inequality question, I think, is key to understanding the kind of dynamics of this hyperglobalized world. The last one, and I'm not going to talk, and Jim talked about this anyway, is of course the climate challenge and the consequences that is having now in terms of the damage it's causing to particularly developing countries, but now we know not only developing countries, and I don't need to go into the consequences of that. But the instability, the uncertainty that is now surrounding the climate challenge can only be met, I think, in the way that Jim, I think, began to describe. It requires a change of course in terms of policy if we are going to prevent the kind of existential threat that is implicit in the changing climate that we're experiencing. And clearly that is not doable under the current framework that has been created by this neoliberalized and highly financialized world. So, you know, a lot of the work that we've been trying to do, in a way, is doing what is very much mirroring what Jim talked about in the need for a fundamental change in the way in which policy at the national level is pursued. And I think these are the elements that we've talked about in the work that we've done, arguing for Green New Deals, both in the advanced and the developing world. And it's a familiar set of ingredients. I don't think I need to go into it in any detail, but we can't make this transition away from the current arrangements in a world of austerity. So we need to ditch austerity and shift to what we would call a wage-led growth strategy. We need a lot of public investment. Private investment will be important, but it can't lead the process, I think, for the reasons, again, that Jim talked about. And so there needs to be a real public investment push into both different sorts of energy systems, but also in the related areas that need to expand around the care economy. For example, we need to change the taxation system. We need industrial policy to make sure that private investment supports this kind of transition rather than works against it. And we need different types of financing arrangements that are supportive of productive investment and employment, rather than endlessly speculate on asset prices and arbitraging, which I think is true of much of both the commercial banking system and the shadow banking system that has grown significantly over this period. And again, just to repeat what Jim said, this requires planning. It requires strategic planning. It requires policy coordination at the domestic level across a whole range of policies if we're going to change course in a direction that can not only address the climate challenge, but can do it whilst also addressing the problems of inequality and insecurity and unsustainable debt, which has been a feature of this hyperglobalized world. I guess our point is that many countries, I think all countries actually, but particularly the countries that we look at in the developing world, cannot be expected to undertake this kind of strategy and shift without support from and determined support from a functioning multilateral system that can channel the resources and to support this kind of move in developing countries. And this is our big issue because we don't think that the current multilateral system is fit for purpose. Indeed, unfortunately, we would argue and have argued extensively that in many respects, the current multilateral financial institutions have encouraged precisely the forms of hyperglobalization that are part of the problem that we face rather than a solution to those problems. And to some extent, and the book that Manfred kindly mentioned tries to go into the history of the evolution of multilateralism. I don't really want to go into that today, other than to suggest, at least it's implicit in the arguments we present, that the way in which the IMF and the World Bank operate today are much closer to the League of Nations in the 1920s and the kinds of economic advice that it extended then than it was to the principles of the people that founded Bretton Woods in the 1940s. We call those the Morgenthau principles because these were the principles that Morgenthau himself articulated when he presented the case for the US agreeing to the Bretton Woods document, when he presented that to the Money and Banking Committee of the US House. And these were the basic principles that he identified as being the ones that the Bretton Woods institutions would pursue, and why these were good for the American people was the case that Morgenthau made. We argue in the book that those principles have been lost in the current operations of the multilateral financial institutions. We need to recover those principles if we're going to move forward. But recovering those principles is not enough. I mean, there were real weaknesses in the original design of the Bretton Woods institutions, particularly with respect to developing countries. And so it's not simply a question of going back to these institutions as they were set up in the 1940s. It's very much the need to reform those institutions in light of the challenges that we face in the 21st century, and those are much more demanding challenges than was true of the operations of the Bretton Woods institutions in the 1950s and the 1960s. Partly because we have to add green structural transformation to national policy goals. Partly because I think we need to bring development much more forcefully into the way in which these multilateral financial institutions operate, and that was, in our view, something that was not done properly in the 1940s and subsequently over the next 2 decades, which was a kind of golden era for these institutions. And to do that, we need to reform. We need to see some serious reforms to the international financial system. We need to see serious reforms to the international trade and investment regimes. And we do need to see a huge scaling up of development finance. And I don't want to run out of my time, so I don't want to abuse my time. We offer a series of reforms to the monetary, trade, and financing systems that we think will be necessary if the kind of policies that we have been articulating, and I think that Jim articulated, are going to become the dominant policy paradigm at the national level over the course of the next few years and decades, and that crudely involves this mobilization, a stepwise increase in what the World Bank in particular, but also its sister organizations were meant to do, which was development financing, and to bring in the climate goals as well as traditional development goals into those into the workings of those institutions. It means in particular in the context of the trade regime, of reducing the level of interference that trade agreements at both the multilateral and the regional level have introduced into that system. It requires far more regulating and monitoring of the large players in the international trading system, and international trade is not dominated by small enterprises and medium-sized enterprises. It's dominated by very large corporations, as I suggested earlier, and those can only be properly regulated at the international level, and we need to think about ways of how we do that effectively. And it requires a series of what we call incremental changes to the workings of particularly the IMF and the World Bank in terms of the way in which they allocate liquidity to ensure that the deflationary option is not the default option for correcting imbalances in the economy. The role of special drawing rights, which is the reserve asset that the IMF can create, becomes a much more potent tool in preventing the kind of deflationary developments that we are currently seeing. We think that's we think there are real possibilities to do that. We try and outline those in the book. We do recognize that there needs to be a real increase in the capital base of the World Bank and the IMF. They're very conservative lenders. Ironically, they need to be willing to take greater risks and not simply to fixate on their AAA rating, which is what they do currently. We would very strongly argue if they're going to get more capital, however, they need to prune back their tendency to dictate policy options to developing countries, options that tend to be very neoliberal in their orientation and have largely produced a kind of distorted pattern of development in the countries that have been forced to borrow from developing countries. So yes, more capital is needed in these institutions, but they need to get out of the job of dictating policies to the countries that come to borrow from them. We would argue in that context there's a bigger role than is so far taken by regional financial organizations. I think they need to be scaled up significantly. They have a better feel for the challenges that countries face than we think the multilaterals tend to have. And there's a big role in them backing national development banks, as I said, as I mentioned earlier. The real big reform that we advocate in the book and in the work that we do in UNCTAD is the need to have independent mechanisms to deal with unsustainable debt levels. If we don't remove the burden of debt from many developing countries, the just transition and the sustainable development goals will simply not take place. It's impossible for countries to mobilize the kind of resources on the scale that we're talking about when they are flattened by this mountain of unsustainable debt that they've acquired over the course of the last 2 decades. And the only way we think to do that is through a proper multilateral debt restructuring mechanism, not in the IMF or the World Bank, because they are themselves creditors. It needs to be independent of creditors, and it needs to be able to enact measures in a timely and as fair way as is possible, including not just for the multilateral lenders, but very importantly for private lenders, because they have over the course of the last 2 decades become much more significant players. That's for us the big reform that needs to take place if we're going to make the kind of course correction that I've briefly tried to outline, I think. And I think that the one that Jim also outlined in his presentation. So let me leave it there, Manfred. It was a little rushed, but I hope it was of some use and interest.
Not only was it of some use of interest, Richard, it was incredibly pertinent and focused. I really want to draw attention to the fact that some of your graphs were really very striking in illustrating the core forces that have led us to this impasse, particularly the emphasis and the clear statistical reflection of the increasing monopolization of the world. I won't take too much of the time here, but the absolutely fundamental contradiction in the neoliberal model. And it has been that it has led to dramatic income inequality, which the crocodile graph illustrated and which we all know about it. But that process has created a huge contradiction, because as profits and profitability has increased, real spending, real purchasing power has been throttled. And that was, of course, Keynes's insight in the 1930s, why he tried to shift the whole focus of economics. And as a result, capital has increasingly moved into speculative, rent-seeking activities. And that is what is, to a very significant degree, driving the current inflation process. And in that context, the use of higher interest rates to try to curb this process is extremely ill-advised and even absurd. In any case, let me open the floor. I know Susan Tanner has a comment. So where is the microphone? Oh, we're so far.
Thank you very much, Richard. I can remember back to listening to you at IDRC and a similarly wonderful presentation. Thank you. It's your last slide on the horizon that I'm worried about. It's a double-barreled question. Sitting where you are in the center of the world, so to speak, what do you think is on the horizon, or the timing that we might have on any of these changes? And in that question, I'm also wanting to ask you about what kind of consideration there is about biodiversity collapse. We hear a lot about climate now, but biodiversity collapse is the partner. And I'm worried about the prospective collapse of food sources around the world. And we all know that famine relates to war. So to circle back to the horizon issue about timing, do we have any chance at all? Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. That's it's the big question, of course. What are the forces? Where are the forces for political change? One of the frustrations of an organization like UNCTAD, which was the secretariat really, that backstopped the efforts of developing countries in the 1970s to argue for a new international economic order. The developing world is simply, it doesn't have that kind of political cohesion or forcefulness at the moment that characterize that moment in international political economy, and then we can think why that well, we kind of know what we know, that the debt crisis of the 1980s was a major fragmenting influence on developing on the solidarity of developing countries, and that's a frustration for an organization like UNCTAD that as developing countries have become more fragmented, has become a much less powerful voice in the multilateral discussions. Having said that, there are signs, I think, of new thinking and new arrangements in the developing world that I think hold out some possibility of them providing a degree of countervailing influence. That's, to some extent, that's true of the emergence of the BRICS, although that's a very heterogeneous group of developing countries that don't necessarily see eye to eye on all matters, but that's happening. You have to bring in China here, and I know it's a controversial issue, and people have different views of whether China's actions are contributing to a different way forward or acting as a barrier to progress. We argue that China has played a positive role. I think there are things that China has to do differently, including on issues around debt, but it is being forced into thinking about these issues now, given the current circumstances. And so China's role, in one way or another, is critical to forging a different sort of framework for international cooperation. Without China, it won't work. That's clear. And I think when you add other developing countries to that, there are some opportunities. We have seen the emergence of new regional financing arrangements over the course of the last decade. That's true of the New Development Bank. It's true of the BRICS Bank. There are certain liquidity facilities that have emerged over this period that suggest a move in a more positive direction. None of them on the scale that we need to deal with the kind of problems that we've been talking about, but they are steps, I think, in the right direction. I guess the source of frustration for us is in the advanced economies. And I would have to argue. I mean, I wouldn't argue it in my day job as a UN official, but the failure of Europe. I think when the new international economic order was a serious attempt to reconfigure the global economy, it wasn't just the developing countries that felt the need to do that. I think it was also true of the European economies. The US had essentially abandoned the original Bretton Woods design by cutting the link of the dollar with gold and essentially floating the dollar. without consultation with the Europeans, of course, and the Europeans played, I think, an important and constructive role in the 1970s about thinking about a new international economic order. I see absolutely no signs of that coming from Europe in its current 21st century manifestation, and that's a real source of frustration, I think, for us, and whether Europe in particular. I mean, ironically, in a way, the Biden discourse was a more positive one. It turned out to be ephemeral, but it was a much more positive one than anything that came out of Europe around the consequences of COVID. Whether there's a internal dynamic in the United States that can recover that initial discussion that we heard around the time of COVID, I'm beginning to be rather pessimistic about. But I have to say, for the first time in my time in UNCTAD, we actually were able to have a dialogue with policymakers in the US, which hadn't happened before. They started to think about industrial policy as an important element of a more resilient economy, for example, and that opened up possibilities, I think, for discourse that could bring in the development dimension. So I don't know. I mean, it's very easy to be pessimistic. I think there are positive signs. We have civil society movements, certainly around the climate agenda, that are becoming stronger. I think that's important. And I see developing countries picking up some of the language of the Green New Deal. A lot in our world for Latin America hinges on what happens in the election in Brazil in a week's time. Lula himself has committed to a Green New Deal for Brazil. That would be an important shift, I think, in terms given Brazil's political and economic weight. There are elements there that kind of are encouraging at the same time that the kind of the larger geopolitics are deeply depressing. On biodiversity, I think you're right. I mean, it's not something we've done a lot on. We have done some work on the oceans economy, which I think is related to that concern beyond the question of warming temperatures, and the notion of a blue New Deal is something that colleagues in UNCTAD are thinking about, and the loss of biodiversity, I know, is a real challenge that we're facing. The UN had a conference recently. It didn't make any progress. It didn't make any progress in terms of the blue economy either. We had conference recently on the need for policing the oceans or regulating the oceans better. In both respects, we still live in a world where corporate power has a profound influence on government policy making, and the oceans are a profitable business for many companies. And until we are, I think, back to Manfred's point, until we're willing, both at the national and the international level, to tackle corporate power in a systematic way, then it's very difficult to make progress along many of these avenues.
Susan.
Hello? Okay. Thank you. Just one last comment. I guess we have one more oxymoron for Jim, which is corporate social responsibility. Thanks very much.
Hello? There we go. Sorry about that. Hi, thank you so much for speaking to us. So you mentioned the impacts of hyperglobalization, and in particular, how despite financial flows having increased, developing countries have not seen an increase in things like infrastructure. So my question is, what solutions would you propose to incentivize investment in developing countries, especially sustainable development, when resources and revenues tend to go to the global financial capitals in the West? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, in some respects, I mean, we would argue that on things like infrastructure, the route, the financing has to be public goods are best delivered by public finance. We're not big believers in public-private partnerships. We've looked at their record. It's not a very good record. So I think when it comes to something like a lot of infrastructure, not all, because I think there are clearly profitable sources of infrastructure development that can be delivered by private investors. But in many developing countries, as was the case in China, it's public finances that need to lead the way. I would strongly argue that the way to the form of the partnership that would work is by properly taxing large international corporations and using that revenue to support infrastructure projects in the developing world. That will be the form of public-private partnership that I would like to see more of. And to some extent, again, it's one of the positives that we've seen in the last couple of years. There has been a recognition about the dangers of illicit financial flows and the need to properly tax international corporations. We saw the G7, G20 initiative begin to take shape. We don't think it's sufficient, but it's an important step forward. So I would make a strong pitch when it comes particularly to infrastructure development for the need to scale up public financing, rather than to hope we can incentivize private capital to make these kind of big investments in long term and to some extent uncertain investment projects with relatively low returns. It's not going to happen, I don't think, and I think we need to think more creatively about finding resources beyond the private sector.
Richard, thank you very much for a really wonderful presentation. I think the discussion has raised additional issues, and it leaves us obviously with a conclusion which is not unexpected, which is that the obstacles facing a adequate response to the crisis that has built up over the past 30 years are enormous. I can't help but just add, you did mention that Biden's discussion of building back better was briefly helpful and positive, and I would agree with that. But I would have to add also that the US's geopolitical aggressiveness over the last 10 years, as I understand it, and particularly the demonization of China, has created an environment in which the possibility of positive outcomes have received an enormous setback in my mind. I hope I'm wrong, but in any case, you've clearly laid out the issues that we have to address, and hopefully in the next couple of days we can make some further progress in clarifying that. Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you, Manfred. Thank you very much.